Welcome to Real Talk with Sarah. In this show, we are tackling a topic that I think we can all relate to: stress. We hear about it from our doctors and in the news, and we know we need to take it more seriously, but we don't know where to start. We feel like our stress levels will reduce sometime in the future, like when we finish this project, or when we make more money, or when we're finally in the right relationship, or when the kids are grown. Then we won't be dealing with so much stress. But that day never seems to come. We create habits that contribute to our stress, and then our bodies adapt and change. We need to take control of our stress levels, and we need to take stress seriously. And that's exactly what we're going to do on this show. I've got Naturopathic Doctor Sarah Vadeboncoeur with me to help us uncover the hidden causes of stress and what we can do to calm down. So let's do this. Episode 11 of Real Talk with Sarah starts right now. My guest today has become an expert on helping people manage and heal from too much stress. She's a naturopathic doctor and an amazing health advocate, and I knew she'd be the exact right person to help us really unpack this topic. We've got a lot to talk about, so welcome, Sarah.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so glad to have you here, and I knew that in this first series of shows, I couldn't possibly walk away from this without making sure that we talked about stress. So let's start with, what is the general definition or your definition of stress?
Right. I think we tend to think about stress as events, right? We think about divorce or losing a job or, a car accident or a major illness. And certainly these are things that cause stress and that are stressors, but that's not actually stress. So events in and of themselves are not stress. How we respond to those events is what stress is.
Okay.
So I always like to say that stress is actually all about perception. So how you perceive your ability to cope and manage in the event of something like an illness or a loss of a job is really what stress is all about. So you can see that stress is really personal, right? Because what causes you stress might be completely different than what causes me stress.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes people can get trapped in, well, just suck it up. Like, I went through that experience. Why is she having such a hard time? Or why is he not able to handle that?
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So all of us experience it very differently, and we'll talk more about this later, but depending on what other factors are happening, our capacity to respond to some of these things might be very high, or sometimes if there's lots of stress, our capacity to respond is very low, and so it hits us a lot harder than it might hit somebody else. So that's how I tend to define stress, really this perception that we're not able to cope or to manage some of these events that are being demanded of us or that are being placed upon us. And so when we look at perception, that's really what stress is, but it also obviously triggers a response. I think we have this tendency to think that stress is only happening in our heads, but it's happening to our entire bodies.
Yeah.
So essentially what happens is anytime your brain perceives a stress, it will trigger a cascade of events that will eventually activate the adrenal glands. So most of us aren't super familiar with our adrenal glands, but they're these two teeny tiny glands that sit in our low back, right on top of our kidneys. And one of the main things that our adrenal glands do is they secrete stress hormones. Most people have probably heard of cortisol and adrenaline, and these hormones are really designed to help our body cope in times of stress.
So we go through something stressful, let's say we're in a fender bender.
Yes.
Our adrenal glands secrete cortisol and adrenaline.
Yes.
Okay.
And so the reason that happens is so when you're in a fender bender or you get really bad news, the body kind of reacts to allow you to, number one, to survive. That's what our body is ultimately trying to do at kind of a really fundamental level, is keep us alive and keep us safe. So the reason that we release these stress hormones is they help us to do that. They help to keep us alive and they help to keep us safe.
How do they help us keep us alive
Good
and
question.
safe? Yeah.
So some of the things that they do is they raise our heart rate and they raise our blood pressure so that we can physically respond to a stress. It's also going to send lots of energy to our brain so that we can make the right decisions and so that we can think clearly when there's something really stressful happening.
Okay.
It's also going to send lots of energy to our heart and our lungs, as well as to our arms and our legs, so that we can literally run away from stress. So I know a lot of us would probably like to run away from our lives sometimes, but fortunately for most of us, we're not usually in physical danger, but it doesn't matter. The body still responds, in the same way that it did when we were hunter-gatherers.
Yes.
And we were having to run because
from a saber-toothed tiger.
That's right, or to catch our dinner, right? So our system still evolves. And so what's happened is now there's obviously a huge disconnect between the type of stress that we experience and the way that our bodies respond to stress. So we were designed to manage stress. Our bodies are really good at handling stress, but we were really designed to deal with short, intense bursts of stress followed by long periods of relaxation. If we go back to the hunter-gatherer, you would be, running to catch your dinner, which would be highly stressful, but once you caught your dinner, you go back to your cave, you make a feast, you relax, you sleep for the night, and you start again the next day.
Right.
The stress we have now is obviously not like that. No. It's chronic. It tends to be lower grade. So, most of us don't have these catastrophic events. Some of us do. But most of us have this low grade, chronic, unrelenting stress that's happening every day, usually from the minute we wake up to the moment we go to bed. And it's happening day after day, week after week, month after month.
And then can I ask, so let's say we're dealing with this chronic stress day after day, month after month, year after year.
Yes.
And then we have highly stressful events.
Yes.
Is it a compounded effect?
It is.
And then we can't handle those acute stresses nearly as well because we're dealing with this chronic stress.
You got it.
Okay.
So there's this concept I really like about metabolic reserve. And so basically this is the idea that our bodies have basically a reservoir of energy that is used to manage stress. So if you generally have, low levels of stress, you take really good care of yourself, you sleep well every night, your reservoir is going to be pretty full. And so if you have a very stressful event, you're going to have more capacity to deal with that. Whereas you look at the way that most of us are living, every day is stressful, so that reservoir is getting depleted, and then you add on a major stressor, and the body is completely unable to handle it because the reservoir is already empty.
So, I think most people know if their stress is work-related or they're in relationship stress or they've got kids going through stuff. And so they kind of can tell us that, people can say, that's what my stress is coming from. But I think there are a lot of hidden stresses that we aren't even aware of. Talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll definitely talk about that. But before, I just want to say, I find it really interesting how much we've normalized stress, right? So most of us have really busy schedules. We have, long work hours. We have family requirements. And most of us feel stressed on a day-to-day basis. And one of the things that I always find interesting is I ask every single patient, how do you rate your stress levels? And how is your capacity to cope with that stress? And invariably, I get answers like, oh, I have some stress, but I'm doing fine, or I don't have more stress than my friends and family members. And then over the course of the next hour, they tell me I'm working 60 hours a week, my marriage is falling apart, my mom just got diagnosed with Alzheimer's and I'm caring for her, and add in some financial stress, right? So they're totally disconnected from how much stress they're under and what toll that's taking.
I think that's it's a societal issue because
is.
We are just conditioned to keep taking on more and more and more, and we don't even realize, like you're saying, we don't even put that in the stress category. We put that in the life category.
That's right. Yeah. And I would argue that we're probably the generation that's under the most kind of chronic stress. The way that most of us spend our day-to-day and the way that our lives are organized is highly stressful. To get back to your question about stress we might not think about, people don't realize that on top of work and family and finances, there's lots of dietary or lifestyle choices that they might be making that could actually be adding more stress.
Okay, let's talk about those.
Absolutely. So one of the big things is irregular meals or skipping meals. So I see a lot of government workers, because there are a lot of them in the city, and they're notorious for not eating a lunch, or they eat while they're, doing work at their desk.
Yeah.
So what people don't realize is when you skip a meal or your eating schedule is completely different from one day to the next, that puts strain on your system. And the way that it does that is that it causes imbalances in your blood sugar. So when you're skipping lunch or you're going long stretches without eating, you're more likely to start to get low blood sugar. Low blood sugar typically will present as that hangry that we always hear about, right? People are irritable, they're kind of cranky, they really need to eat, they can't think clearly. And so when your blood sugar drops, that causes a stress response, because one of the areas in our body that needs a constant source of glucose or sugar is our brain. So if your blood sugar drops and now your brain is saying, I don't have any glucose, it sends out a stress response. And so it activates those adrenal glands and you release cortisol. Because one of the other things that cortisol does is it raises our blood sugar. So our body has this like amazing capacity to try to protect us, right? Yes. But if you're doing that day in and day out, you're chronically activating that stress response, in addition to obviously all the other things that are probably already stressing you out.
So I have to ask a question. So for people who are, let's say, intermittent fasting, they want to take 16 hours without eating because it's the diet that they're on, or this eating plan that they're on. Is this stressful to the body, or can people get used to that and that becomes their new normal?
Yeah, that's a great question and very timely, because a lot of people are asking about intermittent fasting. I'm a big fan of intermittent fasting for the right people. If you are not sleeping enough, you're not eating healthy food, you've got high levels of stress, it might be really hard for your body to handle intermittent fasting. Because again, that metabolic reserve is probably kind of low, and now you're potentially adding another form of stress. So generally for people who are highly stressed or already really tired or have lots of health issues, I don't usually recommend long periods of intermittent fasting, but I'll often recommend that they start just with like a 12-hour overnight fast. So for example, if you had dinner at 7, you don't eat breakfast until 7. There's lots of great research, especially for women, showing that that's really beneficial, and that shouldn't cause a lot of stress on your system.
Yes, that's exactly the way I like to do it. I try not to eat after 8 p.m. and I try to eat breakfast at about 8 p.m.
Perfect.
At 8 a.m. So that really works for me. What about, just because we're on this intermittent fasting, I know this isn't necessarily about stress, but with the ketogenic diet goes alongside with the intermittent fasting. And how does that affect our glucose levels, because our brains require 60% glucose? So how does that work? Only because I have so many people coming to me asking my thoughts on it, and I want to get your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. I personally don't recommend the ketogenic diet for a couple reasons. Number one, what happens with a ketogenic diet is because you're eating a high-fat, low-carb diet, your brain eventually, instead of using glucose as its main fuel source, will use ketones, which are coming from the fats. So your brain is still getting nourished on a ketogenic diet. So that's not necessarily the concern. But any time that we severely restrict how we're eating in terms of calories, or we're cutting out entire food groups, that typically places stress on the system. And especially for women who, a lot of times we don't have a healthy relationship with food to start with, and you now put an entire category of food kind of in the bad category. In my experience, that puts a lot of mental stress on people. It's also very hard to prep meals for the family or to go out with your girlfriends and eat when you're following a very restrictive diet. So I'm not a fan of restrictive dieting, because it typically doesn't work, because people can't stay on those diets long term. And in the end, it usually causes mental or physiological stress by activating the adrenal glands. And the other thing we'll talk about a little bit later is that the thyroid gland, which controls your metabolism, is highly sensitive to stress. So when you're constantly dieting and you're really restricting yourself, that can actually have a damaging impact on your metabolism, which in the end is obviously the opposite of what you're trying to achieve when you want to lose weight. And it's actually been shown that women who constantly diet and have their weight yo-yo up and down, in the end are going to have a much harder time losing weight, because they've damaged their metabolism in a way.
Oh my goodness, absolutely. So let's keep going. We've got a few minutes left. I want to hear some more of those hidden ways of stress that we wouldn't think about.
So we talked about meal skipping and irregular meals. On the flip side of that would be eating too much. So people who are just eating way too many calories, and especially if those calories are coming from processed foods, refined sugars, people who consume too much alcohol or too much caffeine. The other big thing that I always screen for are nutrient deficiencies. So especially as women, we are, more likely to have nutrient deficiencies. So things that are really common, like iron deficiency or vitamin B12 deficiency. If your body is operating without a key nutrient available, that's going to place stress on your system. And so as soon as one part of the body is struggling, the other parts are going to try to compensate to kind of make up for that. And eventually they will also start to suffer.
You mentioned alcohol and caffeine, and I do want to just touch on those quickly.
Yes.
So alcohol, as you know my story.
I do.
So for so many people, we think that a glass of wine or 2 or 10 after a tough day is the way that we de-stress. How does it work the opposite?
Yeah, absolutely. Wine feels relaxing, certainly, but we know from research that obviously too much consumption, we don't sleep as well, which means we're not recovering from stress well. For women especially, wine obviously is metabolized by the liver, and excess wine can increase estrogen levels, which may increase our risk of breast cancer. There's definitely issues with addiction and overconsumption. So yes, a glass of wine here or there for most women isn't problematic. Neither is a cup of coffee, right? I have so many women who are like, I'm cutting out coffee. And I ask them why, because coffee can be healthy. But what I always say is I want you to have coffee or wine because you love it, not because you need it.
Yes.
And I think that's a very important distinction.
I think that's excellent.
Yeah. The last one that I'll throw in that a lot of people don't think about is commuting. If you're spending an hour or more commuting to the office every day, that can put stress on your system. So especially if it's a stressful commute where you're stuck in traffic or you're waiting for the bus when it's minus 25 like it is today, that's stressful. And if that 1 hour is being taken away from your sleep or from cooking a healthy meal at the end of the day or spending time with your kids, that can obviously make it more damaging because it's taking away from your time to engage in some of these healthy activities.
So what can we do if we have to commute an hour each way every day?
So I encourage people to build some relaxation time into that. So if you're on the bus, put on, a podcast that you love or listen to relaxing music. If you're in the car, put on some relaxing music or a podcast, engage in some deep breathing, call a friend or something like that so that, you're still using that time to engage in some relaxation because I know that some people can't avoid that long commute.
That's the thing. Like what we're talking about today is so important because these are our lives.
Yes.
These are our lifestyles that we create. And we all get that opportunity to create the lifestyle that works for us.
Yeah.
But if we don't even have the awareness around what is causing stress in our lives, like not even knowing that, all those glasses of wine or all that coffee in the morning that we're drinking, we don't even realize that it's causing stress. Skipping meals, I think a lot of people use that as a diet plan.
They do. Yeah.
Right? Like they think, well, if I don't eat, I'm not going to get fat.
Absolutely.
And it just totally works the opposite.
It does.
We don't realize what's going on. So it's when we have this kind of awareness, then we can make changes.
Absolutely.
That's awesome. Well, I'm so excited to continue this conversation. What are we going to talk about after the break?
I think we're going to talk about what stress looks like, so what kind of signs and symptoms to look out for, and then what we can do about it.
Oh my gosh, amazing. Okay, well, stick with us. You're going to learn a lot more after the break. Sarah's going to explain how we can find out if our stress levels are out of balance and what we can do if they are. Back in a moment. Welcome back. If you're just joining us, we're talking about stress on this show, and I've got Naturopathic Doctor Sarah Vadeboncoeur with me, helping us to know what we can do if our stress levels are out of whack. So what do we do? What do we do? If we all know we're under all this stress, how can we get it back?
I think the first piece is awareness, and we chatted about this a little bit earlier, is that most of us are so disconnected from what's happening in our bodies because we're too busy to either one notice or to really pay attention. So the first thing I would encourage people to do is just to tune in to your body and to see what's happening and to see what signals your body might be sending. So our bodies are really good at telling us what's going on. We're just really bad at listening. So just start by tuning in, even if it's 5 minutes a day, and pay attention to what's happening with your energy, your mood, your digestion. These are great ways to kind of get some insight into how your body's doing.
So you'd suggest sort of getting quiet
Yes.
and starting to think about how much energy do I really have when I wake up in the morning?
Yes.
And then when I go to the bathroom, what's happening when that happens?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. So that would be the first piece. The second piece is look at what your days look like. So if you wake up and you feel stressed from the minute you open your eyes because you have to get up and go and you don't stop until, you get into bed at night, you want to evaluate, what's in your schedule. Are those things actually priorities? So most of us, if we ask people, is health a priority, they'll usually put it at the top of the list. When you look at how most of us spend our days, it's probably very low on the list. So again, how is your day being spent? Are there areas or activities that you don't need to be doing or that you can have someone else do or do them less frequently just to lighten the load a little bit?
Yeah, delegation is such a big,
huge.
It's such
huge.
a key, isn't it?
Yeah, it's hard to learn, but it makes a huge difference. And when you wake up, you should be excited about your day and feel passionate about something that's coming up, not dread that you have 14 hours of nonstop stuff to do. So those things are easier said than done, but they are really important because you can do yoga and take vitamins, but if you're not evaluating how you spend each and every day, you're never really going to tackle some of these stress concerns.
Wow.
So if you look at some of these signs and symptoms that we talked about, so initially when people are under high stress and they've got lots of cortisol in their system, we're going to see things like we talked about, an increased heart rate. So for some people, they'll actually feel like palpitations. A lot of people now wear a Fitbit so they can actually see that their heart rate is higher than it should be.
Wow, I thought Fitbits just sort of track number of steps and things like that. I didn't realize.
Yeah, they can check your heart rate. So that's a nice kind of simple tool to see if your heart rate is, consistently above 80 when you're at rest, then your body is potentially under stress.
Okay.
Anxiety and depression are really highly linked to high cortisol and high stress. A lot of people will notice that they start putting on weight, especially in their midsection. So they start to get that like apple shape, or they're getting that, muffin top, like people call it. That can be a sign that there's lots of cortisol in your system.
So cortisol lays down fat, is that right?
It does, yeah. Yes, it does, especially in the midsection. And then trouble sleeping. So a lot of people will find that they either have trouble falling asleep or staying asleep. And I would argue the number one reason why most people have sleep issues is because of stress, because they're not able to shut down their brain, or their body's just not able to wind down enough so that they can get a deep sleep.
So that's what's happening when they wake up too early in the morning at like 3 or 4 in the morning and they're wide awake?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
The other piece I see a lot of in my practice with women is a low sex drive.
Yep.
So a lot of women have a low sex drive and they don't understand why. This is, again, part of the stress response. So if you're under stress and you had, to take a break to have sex, we wouldn't have survived very long. So one of the ways that the body kind of protects itself is by dampening our stress response, our sex drive, to limit the chances that we would become pregnant. Because for anyone who has kids out there, kids tend to increase our stress. So if your body already feels like it's highly stressed out, the last thing it's going to do is, kick up your sex drive and increase the odds that you might get pregnant and have a baby.
So this is why so many new parents, especially new moms, are like, no, thank you.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Yeah. So, it's frustrating, but if you can understand why it's happening, again, your body is infinitely wise. It's doing it for a reason.
Yeah.
So it's a signal that you might need to look at stress. The other piece is memory. A lot of women have really bad memory. They're super forgetful. They have brain fog. They can't think clearly. And again, this is often a sign of stress, because when the body is stressed, it has to pick and choose where to send energy. And obviously, some of these areas are not getting as much attention as they should, because they're not needed for our immediate survival.
So the body doesn't send energy to the brain? So is that when we get brain fog?
It does initially. Like if you were in a car accident, you usually be quite alert. But after chronic cortisol release, so cortisol, again, is meant to be short-term followed by long relaxation. When you've got constant stress and constant cortisol flowing through your system, it actually starts to fry the part of your brain, which is called the hippocampus, which is responsible for our memory. So this is why our memories often start to suffer when we're under high levels of stress. And so because of the damage that cortisol has on the body and kind of long exposure, what will happen after months or years of these high cortisol levels is that the body will actually send a signal to shut down or reduce cortisol because it's trying to protect the brain and it's trying to protect other parts of the body which are being negatively affected by cortisol. So when that switch happens, this is when people start to feel burnt out. These are the people who are exhausted all day. They cannot get out of bed. It takes them like an hour and 3 cups of coffee to become a human in the morning.
Right.
No matter how much sleep they're getting, they always feel tired. They'll often be, depressed. So those are some of the symptoms that will happen after long.
All right, more with Sarah after the break. Welcome back to Real Talk with Sarah. We're talking about stress on this episode, and I've got Naturopathic Doctor Sarah Vadeboncoeur with me, helping us to understand what actually happens inside our bodies when we experience stress. So in the last segment, we talked about sort of how stress occurs and what's going on. What are the treatment options?
Absolutely. So whenever I look at stress, there's 2 things that I always want to focus on. Number 1 is to reduce the stress that's coming in, and number 2 is to make your body more resilient when you are faced with stress. So reducing our stress is a lot of the stuff that we already talked about. Managing your schedule, not overloading yourself with activities, and reducing or eliminating things that are known stressors for you. In terms of how to make your body more resilient, there's a variety of treatments that can really help us to, again, increase that metabolic reserve, which is our capacity to handle stress. So the first piece is always making sure that the basics are in place. You need to sleep. You need to be getting at least 7 hours of good quality sleep every single night, ideally going to bed and waking up around the same time.
What about shift workers?
Yes, shift workers are more difficult in terms of sleep, but I worked with police officers for a year, so I'm familiar with the challenges of shift work. They still need to sleep. They need to probably take melatonin to make sure that they're making enough melatonin, which we'll talk about its relationship to cortisol in the last segment. And they need to make sure that the room is completely dark, which is something that we should all do, but especially shift workers, because you're going to get a much deeper, more restorative sleep if your room is dark.
Okay.
So getting enough sleep, getting enough water, it's so basic, but if your body's dehydrated, that causes stress on your system. Making sure you eat a whole foods-based diet, which sounds ridiculous to say, but so many of us are just eating too many processed foods, and we need to get back to eating real, unprocessed food. Within that, we also want to make sure that we're getting some of the key nutrients that our body needs in order to, manage our stress response. So B vitamins are really important, which I know you're a fan of. And for stress, I'm a big fan of vitamin B5, and B5 is one we don't often think about. We hear about B12, but not B5. B5 is really important for helping with cortisol balance and helping the body respond to stress. Magnesium is probably one of my favorite nutrients, and that's because most people who are under stress tend to have low levels of magnesium.
And what kind of magnesium? There are several types.
There are. I'm a big fan of glycinate because magnesium glycinate is magnesium which is bound to glycine, and glycine is incredibly calming. So magnesium glycinate for me is the most calming type of magnesium. Good for helping you sleep, good if you carry a lot of tension from being stressed out, great for headaches, PMS, constipation. It's great for a variety of things. And then vitamin C is also really important because the area in the body that has the largest concentration of vitamin C is actually in the adrenal gland. So it's one of those key factors that we need to allow the adrenal gland to recover and to be able to work appropriately.
And are you recommending that we get these vitamins through food alone or through supplementing as well?
Right. Right. It really depends. So obviously food is the most important piece, and in an ideal world we would all get our nutrients from food, but that's not usually the case for most of us. So I always like to use the example of a car, right? If you're only putting gas in your tank, once a month, but you're driving your car around town every single day, your car's going to run out of gas. So if you're just relying on food to give you your nutrients, but from the minute you wake up to the minute you go to bed, you're running around nonstop, there's going to be a mismatch between the output, which is the energy that you're expanding, and the input, which is your diet. So that's where supplements can be really helpful. And that's where the IV vitamins that we offer at our clinic can be really beneficial. So the reason I love intravenous vitamins, which basically just means giving vitamins through IV, so directly into the bloodstream, is that we can give nice high doses, so much higher than you would find simply in your food, and your body's able to absorb it right away. So it's giving your body this nice boost of nutrition so that it can start to heal and, calm some of the areas that might be negatively impacted by stress.
Could we otherwise... We wouldn't want to take a bunch of, let's say, vitamin D, for example,
right.
But having it by IV is a safe way to do it?
So we don't usually give vitamin D by IV. We actually give it by injection, so in the muscle. And certainly you can overdo it with some vitamins. The vitamins that we give in our IVs are all water soluble, meaning if your body doesn't need it that day or if it's a little bit too much, you will pee it out. So there's very little risk of taking too much. Vitamin D is fat soluble, so there is a higher potential risk of taking too much. Having said that, if you live in Canada, you are vitamin D deficient if you're not taking a supplement.
Totally.
And I test vitamin D on most of my patients. It's not a question of if you're low, it's a question of how low.
Yes.
So for my patients who have extremely low vitamin D levels, a few injections of vitamin D completely changes how they feel in terms of their energy and their mood. Aches and pains often go away. So they certainly don't replace a healthy diet, but injections and IV treatments can really help boost your levels up quickly, especially if you are known to be deficient.
All right.
And the other reason I love them as a tool is that when you're so run down and tired, you're usually not cooking good meals, you're not taking care of yourself, you're not exercising. So if we can use IV temporarily to give you a boost so that you can start to engage in some of these kind of daily healthy activities, then I see that as a great use of that tool in the short run to kind of help with your health long term.
Absolutely. We have 30 seconds left.
Okay.
Any other tips for this segment before we go to the next one?
Yes, hands-on treatment. So I'm a big fan of acupuncture, massage. So, a lot of us don't get a lot of hands-on affection, and especially if we're single or we're not in a relationship, sometimes we lack that physical contact. Massage has been shown to significantly reduce cortisol and stress levels. I'm a big fan of yoga, going outside and walking. These are simple things, but they're so effective.
Amazing. Well, after the break, Sarah is going to share some of her favorite daily practices we can all use for reducing stress. Back in a moment.
You're watching Rogers TV.
Welcome back to Real Talk. We're talking about stress on this show, and I've got Naturopathic Doctor Sarah Vadeboncoeur with me to help us understand the importance of getting our stress levels under control. I am so glad you're here teaching us about all of this. You've brought something pretty cool with you to show us how we can get our saliva tested to see how high our cortisol is.
Yes. So the reason I love this test is that for a lot of women, again, they don't realize they're under stress, and sometimes they need to see it on a piece of paper to start making change or to realize what's actually happening in their system.
Now, I know you work with mostly women in your practice, but this is, of course, applicable to all men as well. But is it that more women are coming in complaining about stress, or?
Yes, more women see health practitioners in general, and certainly that's true with naturopathic doctors. But I would also argue that women are under different types of stress than men are. We tend to have a lot more family-related stress, we tend to carry a lot of the load at home. So sometimes women experience stress more acutely than men do, but absolutely men are also under enormous amounts of stress. Oh, sorry.
That's okay. I'm going to just show this box. So
Yep.
can we get these obviously through you, or we could do this test through your practice?
So most naturopathic doctors will offer this testing. The reason I love a saliva test for looking at cortisol is it really helps us to see what's happening throughout the entire day. So in a healthy individual, when you wake up, within that first hour of waking up, you're going to get your highest surge of cortisol. That gets you out of bed, gets you energized, ready to take on your day.
Okay.
And then your cortisol should gradually fall as the day progresses, and it would be at its lowest point around midnight when you're fast asleep. So a lot of people will do a blood test to check their cortisol levels. So the problem with that is if you're doing a blood test, you're just seeing one time of the day. So you have no idea what your cortisol levels were 2 hours before or what they might be 2 hours later. So you're not getting a full picture. And for a lot of people, getting a blood draw is stressful.
Right.
So the simple fact of having a needle inserted in your arm might raise your cortisol. So it's going to artificially, raise your actual levels.
That's such a good point.
So
yeah.
the reason I love the saliva testing, because there's no needles involved, and it gives us a lot more information.
That's a lot of tubes that come.
It is a lot of tubes. It's 4 tubes. So what I love about this test is a test you do at home. And essentially all you do is when you wake up in the morning, within the first hour, you spit into the tube.
Okay.
Before lunch, you spit into a second tube, another one before dinner, and another one before bed. And so what this test allows us to do is to literally map out your cortisol throughout the day to see, number one, are you making too much cortisol? Are you making not enough cortisol? And third, are you following that normal curve that you should be following? So this is a great test because it gives us all of that information. And from the same saliva, we could also look at estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, and DHEA, which is another big stress hormone that we haven't really talked about. So it's a really nice comprehensive look at what's happening in terms of our hormones and our stress response. And one of the things that I see a lot of, because I tend to see people when they're quite tired and burnt out, is we'll see just like a completely flat cortisol curve, and that's typically a sign that your body has been under stress for years, if not decades, where the body has shut down that cortisol production. And again, these are the people who are just tired and burnt out. And the reason that it's so important for us to have this information is there's more and more research showing how stress is associated with all chronic diseases. But one study in particular really struck me, and it was a study that looked at women who had a flat cortisol curve.
Yeah.
And if those women were diagnosed with breast cancer, they were more likely to die from breast cancer because their immune system was not as good at healing and kind of allowing them to recover and heal from the breast cancer.
Because their body is simply just trying to survive.
It is.
Wow.
Yeah. So we didn't talk about this earlier, but again, this concept that when the body's under stress, it has to pick and choose where to send energy.
Yes.
And one of the areas that gets ignored is the immune system. So perfect example is, think about it when you were a student, and as soon as you finished your exam, you got sick.
Yes.
Every time, right? And so that just shows the direct link between stress and the immune system.
Or as soon as people go on their vacation that they've been so excited to go on,
Yes.
they get sick.
Absolutely.
Finally, they're taking that downtime.
Yeah. So that's one of kind of the unintended consequences that we might not realize. And I'm not trying to scare people, but a big passion of mine is for helping women to realize how much stress is affecting them. And it's not just happening in your head, it's literally happening to every single cell in your body. So when your body is under this chronic stress, it's having lots of impacts that you may not feel or see, or it may not even show up for months or years. But it's obviously so important for us to manage our stress and to, again, create that metabolic reserve so that we can handle stress more appropriately.
So I guess what you're also saying then is that we really do have to wake up in the morning and assess how we're actually feeling. Because I think for a lot of us, we just get up out of bed, we have a million things we have to do, parents with kids, and everyone's got to get out the door, busy jobs, commutes.
Yeah.
I mean, it's making me wonder, how can we take that step back that's required to finally get that stress under control?
Yeah. Again, like I said, these are not easy things to do, but at the end of the day, we need to ask ourselves, like, what's more important, our health or like our 8-year-old son or daughter's hockey career? What's more important, like your health or having this like big, beautiful house, but that means you have to commute 2 hours to get to work? So, you know, they're not easy choices, but at the end of the day, we all have choices that we're able to make in order to, again, try to reduce or eliminate some of these stressors and to carve out that time. So again, you know, I said this earlier, it's not the activation of the stress response that's a problem, is that it never gets turned off. So even something as simple as creating a few minutes every day that you're taking for, you know, I call it a stillness practice, that you quiet your mind, you quiet your body, and you just relax. One of my favorite quotes is that we're human beings, not human doings.
Yes.
But most of us spend no time being, we spend all our time doing. So again, just a few minutes every day of like being, just being quiet and just tuning in and seeing what happens, that can go a long way in terms of helping to balance out the stress that we're under. But right now there's just a huge disconnect, again, between how much stress we deal with on a daily basis and how little relaxation we have to help, you know, counter that.
And I do think it's such a struggle for so many people, because we feel, and I'm guilty of this, like we want to keep achieving, we want more, we want bigger, we want the second car, the bigger home, the cottage on the lake, and to think that those things are not what are most important.
No.
Really, like you said, people put health at the top of the list, but what are you actually doing?
They don't act like health is at the top of the list. And certainly, I mean, I'm someone who has, you know, lots of like dreams and hopes, and I want to achieve great things, but not at the expense of my health. And so I think it's always checking in with yourself and seeing, is what I'm doing and how I'm spending my day contributing to my health, or is it taking away from my health? And if it's taking away, what are some simple changes that I might be able to make that are going to help to kind of rebalance that input and output, if you will, a little bit better?
What can parents do when they suspect that their children are under stress?
Yeah, that's a really big one. And I think children are under a lot of stress. Again, a lot of children are overscheduled.
Yes.
They have nutritional stress sometimes because they're not eating very healthy foods. The thing that we often talk about in our clinic is that children are watching everything you do and they're listening to everything you say. So a lot of parents are so concerned about their kids, but they're not taking any time for themselves, because they feel like if they're not 100%, you know, there for their kids, that they're doing
failing.
Absolutely.
But doing them an injustice.
Your kids are learning coping skills and relaxation from you. So if they don't see you modeling that, they're not going to learn it, you know, elsewhere. So it's really important. I mean, I have a 2.5-year-old at home, so I get that things are busy and stressful, but I make it a priority in my life to show him that I have time for myself. I go to yoga regularly. I'm taking a pottery class right now on Saturday mornings, which means that I am away from him for a few hours, which is totally fine, and I don't feel guilty about it, because I know that I'm going to be a better mom and person by doing that, and that he's going to learn that it's important to make time for yourself.
I think that's so key. They really are watching everything the adults in their lives are doing. And I think that that also plays in with when parental relationships are really stressful.
Yes.
I think kids can, first of all, learn that that's how to be in a relationship, which isn't the healthiest way of being. And they feel that stress. They're so energetic, right? We all are, but we kind of turn it off.
Kids are very sensitive to that. And they've actually done studies where they'll measure cortisol levels in mums and babies. And so if the mom is holding her child and her cortisol is high, the child's cortisol levels will go up.
Wow.
So there is a physiological response that your kids are experiencing when you're under stress. So that's why it's so important, I mean, for everyone, but especially for parents, to really try to make time for relaxation.
Definitely. We got to get this next generation up in understanding of what's really important.
Absolutely.
So speaking of what's really important, you have some top tips that you want to share with us. What are they?
Number one is learning to say no.
Okay.
No, I think, is the most underspoken word, again, especially by a lot of women. When people ask us for something, we have a tendency to say, sure, we don't want to hurt any feelings, we don't want to let anyone down. We need to learn to say no. And again, you don't have to give an explanation, you don't have to give an excuse, just say, no, I can't do that, or no, I can't attend that event. When you learn to say no, you learn to say yes to yourself, right? And if you can reframe it, instead of feeling guilty that you're letting someone down, just reframe it that, no, I'm actually making time for myself, and my health is, just as important as the other person.
That reminds me of a saying I heard when people were talking about shopping, especially at the holidays.
Yeah.
When I buy things that I do not need, I steal from myself. So kind of a similar concept. Okay,
absolutely.
What's your number 2?
Number 2 is not overloading our schedules. So again, this is a really big problem that most of us are going nonstop from the minute we wake up to the moment we go to bed. So again, if there's any activities we can adjust or that don't need to be in there. And second would be scheduling what's important. So if yoga is important or going for a walk, literally putting that into your schedule. People always say they don't have time. You're never going to find time in your schedule. You have to make time. So make time for what's important. Number 3 would be make time for passion projects. So I just mentioned pottery and yoga. Those are things that I really love and make me feel really happy. So I encourage people to try different things, do something new, and find what ignites your passion. Again, so many people are waking up every day and there's nothing exciting in their day, which is, of course, you're not going to feel excited about your day. So find something that fuels that passion and try to make time for it on a regular basis.
Love that one.
Number 4 is expressing emotions. A lot of us are not expressing emotions, especially the not so nice emotions.
Yes.
Your body is literally listening to every single word that you're thinking or that you're saying to yourself. So if you've got lots of resentment or anger or negative self-talk, your body is picking up on that, and that's another big source of stress. So another, of my favorite sayings, if we talk to our friends the way we talk to ourselves, we wouldn't have any friends.
Totally.
Right? So be kind to yourself, express what you need to express. Last but not least is practice mindfulness. A lot of people cringe when we talk about mindfulness. They think, I have to meditate, I hate meditation, it doesn't work for me, it's just another thing I have to add to my to-do list. If you don't like meditation, that's okay, although I would argue that if you hate it, you probably need it the most. But something as simple as practicing mindfulness when you're engaging in activities you're already doing. So when you're brushing your teeth, instead of thinking about what's coming up in your day or scanning Instagram, pay attention to brushing your teeth. What does the toothpaste smell like? What does it taste like? What does it feel like on your teeth? It sounds so basic, but it's just about being present in the moment and actually paying attention. And most of us are living so far in advance or, worried about the past that we're missing the present and we're basically missing everything.
We're missing our lives.
We are.
We really are, so many of us stuck in the past. And I would argue that that's a big source of stress.
It is.
When we just keep lamenting the past or regurgitating something that happened, an event. And I know that that's not to discount that people have to work through some painful episodes and move past them.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we can just keep going over and over and over in our heads when we were in grade 6 and that teacher said that nasty thing or that boy did that thing or that girl said that thing.
Yeah.
I mean, at the end of the day, we are here right now. We have to.
And this is all we
forward.
have, right?
Yes.
This moment is all we have. And one of the interesting concepts that I've heard is that people who tend to live kind of in the future are people who are highly anxious, right? Yeah. They're worrying about things that are probably never going to happen, but yet their body can't tell. Your body can't tell whether a stress is actually happening or whether it's happening in your head. So when you're constantly anxious and thinking about the future, you're triggering that stress response. Whereas people who are living in the past often are more on the depressed side. Wow. So mindfulness has been shown to really help both with anxiety and depression, but just help us to focus on what's happening right now and trying not to worry so much about what might happen or what has already happened and can't be changed.
Absolutely amazing. Well, I don't think there are many people who haven't experienced high levels of stress in their lives, but with awareness comes the opportunity to change. And I believe there are people watching who are going to make some big changes in their lives. Thank you, Sarah. When I come back, I'll share my final thoughts. Back in a moment. someone who has always felt that I handle stress really well. Like many of you, I've experienced some pretty tough situations in my life, and because of my ability to assess, make plans, and execute on those plans, I felt like I had my stress under control. It wasn't until I had my cortisol levels tested that I was able to really see my stress in a whole new way. What I learned is that my body doesn't care if I appear to be handling everything. I am still putting my body under undue stress, and over the past few months, I've really prioritized this area of my health. I'm so glad I have, because I can tell you that I feel a marked difference in my energy levels, my mood, my libido, my happiness, and my overall health and wellness. I began a daily practice of meditation. I began unapologetically expressing my emotions. I began practicing mindfulness, especially around meal times when I can tend to zone out a little. I started taking more breaks during the day to stretch or go for a walk. I started taking methylated B vitamins, and I started saying no way more often. And when I do say no, I check in with myself so that I don't succumb to feelings of guilt around my decisions. I'm a work in progress, and while I don't believe any of us will ever be completely stress-free living in this busy and fast-paced world, we can push back on stress and build a life that feels a lot more calm. Thank you to my guest, Dr. Sarah Vadeboncoeur, for opening our eyes to the ways stress is affecting our health and wellness and the importance of getting it under control. Until next time, I want you to remember one thing, that no matter where you are and no matter how it feels, you are never, ever alone. See you next time.